When I first moved back into my childhood home after my parents' sudden passing, I thought the worst of my nightmares were the memories that lingered within its walls. The fights, the silence, the way my mother's voice always trembled when she spoke about keeping things quiet. The house was a decrepit relic now, sagging under the weight of secrets it seemed eager to shed, and as the sole heir, I felt an obligation to sift through the mess. The first few days passed uneventfully as I sorted through dusty photo albums and brittle letters, but it wasn't long before the silence grew suffocating, the kind that seemed too heavy for just one person to bear. It started with little things. Creaks on the floorboards when no one was walking, shadows in the corners of my vision that disappeared the moment I turned to look, the faint sound of whispering that seemed to come from the vents at night. I blamed it on grief and exhaustion, until the night I found the attic key, tucked inside the lining of my father's old coat. My parents had always told me the attic was off limits, a space filled with nothing but dangerous clutter and weak floorboards, but something compelled me to go up there. The air grew colder as I climbed the narrow staircase, my flashlight flickering as though protesting the journey. At first, I saw nothing but the usual attic fare: cobweb-draped furniture, old boxes stacked like gravestones, the faint smell of mildew. But then I noticed the trunk, a massive wooden chest that sat oddly in the center of the room, as though it had been waiting for me. My hands shook as I unlatched it, revealing neatly folded children's clothes, small shoes, and a stack of journals wrapped in a faded ribbon. They weren't mine. My parents never mentioned siblings, but the handwriting in those journals, the looping scrawl that mirrored my mother's, told a story of children, 3 of them, who had lived in this house before me. The entries began innocently enough, chronicling birthdays and school events, but as I read further, the tone shifted. "Something's wrong with James," one entry read. "He talks to the shadows now, says they tell him secrets." Another, dated months later, was almost illegible, written in frantic scribbles. "The shadows want us all. They said we have to give one." My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, each more horrifying than the last, until they abruptly stopped. There was no explanation, no goodbye, only an empty, aching silence that mirrored the one I'd felt my whole life. Beneath the journals, I found a photograph. 3 children with wide, hollow eyes standing beside my parents, who looked years younger but equally haunted. I didn't recognize the children, but their faces felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. Then the scratching began, faint at first, like nails on wood, growing louder with each passing second. It was coming from the walls. Panicked, I stumbled back and dropped the photograph, only to see that the children's faces in the image had twisted, their smiles stretching unnaturally wide as though they were laughing at me. I ran, slamming the attic door shut behind me, but the scratching followed, now accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to grow louder the harder I tried to ignore them. That night, I dreamed of the children, their pale faces pressed against mine as they whispered secrets I couldn't understand, their icy fingers digging into my skin. When I woke, my arms bore bruises in the shape of small hands. I tried to leave the house the next morning, but the doors wouldn't budge, and every window reflected not the outside world but the attic, its darkness yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. The whispers became relentless, invading every corner of my mind until I couldn't tell if they were in the house or inside me. I tried calling for help, but my phone would only play the sound of my own voice, screaming from somewhere far away. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time had lost all meaning before I realized what the house wanted. The trunk had reappeared in the living room one morning, open and empty, waiting. The whispers spoke more clearly now, urging me to finish what they started, to pay the debt, to give one so the rest could stay. I didn't understand until I remembered the journals, the final entry, and the blood-stained pages I had found beneath them, spelling out a single word: sacrifice. The house demanded a life, and I was the only one left to give it. As I sit here now, the shadows pooling at my feet, the whispers growing deafening, I wonder if my parents ever intended for me to uncover the truth. Perhaps they hoped the house would consume me quietly, that the cycle would end with me. But I see now that this house is insatiable, its hunger eternal. My fingers tremble as I write this, the shadows creeping closer, their cold breath on my neck. If you find this, if you hear the whispers, run. But know this, the house will follow. It always does. I always knew my family was strange, but nothing could have prepared me for the secret that festered beneath the facade of our crumbling estate. The house had stood for generations, its once pristine walls now sagging with age, the wood groaning as though burdened by the weight of too many memories. I inherited it after my grandmother's death, the last of a lineage shrouded in whispers and half-told tales. Moving in felt like stepping into the jaws of a predator, but the allure of solving the riddles of my ancestry was too enticing to resist. My grandmother had been a woman of routines, her life a sequence of patterns she followed with almost religious devotion, and the house reflected that rigidity. Every room was meticulously arranged, every drawer neatly packed, except for the east wing, which had always been locked. Growing up, I'd asked her about it countless times, but she'd dismiss my curiosity with a tight smile and a stern warning to never try and open it. Now that she was gone, I found the key in an envelope, marked only with my name in her spidery handwriting. The lock resisted at first, as if reluctant to surrender its secrets, but with a sharp click, the door swung open, revealing a hallway that seemed to stretch further than the house should allow. The air was thick and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, a grotesque floral pattern that seemed to writhe under the dim light of my flashlight. As I ventured further, I noticed something unsettling. There were no windows, no doors leading to other rooms, just the endless stretch of corridor that seemed to shift subtly as though alive. Then I reached it, the room. It wasn't marked, yet I knew this was what my grandmother had warned me about. The door was different, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to pulse under my touch, as though the wood was alive. My hands trembled as I turned the knob and stepped inside. At first glance, it appeared empty, but the longer I stood there, the more I felt the space pressing in on me, suffocating and oppressive. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces tarnished with age, and in their reflections, I saw things that didn't exist in the room. A young girl standing in the corner, her head bowed, a shadow crawling across the floor though there was no source of light. I called out, my voice trembling, but the girl didn't move. As I stepped closer, her head snapped up, revealing empty eye sockets that seemed to bore into my soul. I stumbled back, slamming into one of the mirrors, and in that instant, the glass shattered, revealing not wood or plaster behind it, but something dark and infinite. A voice whispered my name, low and guttural, and the shadows began to pour out, forming shapes that writhed and clawed at the air. I ran, tripping over my own feet as the corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. The whispers followed, growing louder, filling my head with words I couldn't understand but somehow felt were meant for me. By the time I reached the main house, I was gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I locked the door behind me, but the whispers didn't stop. That night, I dreamt of the girl, her hollow eyes staring at me as she stood at the foot of my bed. When I woke, the marks of tiny hands were pressed into the dust on the floorboards. Days turned to weeks, and the house seemed to come alive around me. Doors I had locked would swing open on their own. The mirrors in the other rooms began to show things that shouldn't be there. My reflection, but distorted, grinning when I wasn't. I tried to leave, but every road out of the property seemed to loop back to the front gates. I was trapped. Desperation drove me back to the east wing, back to the room, hoping that confronting it might somehow free me. This time, the door opened easily, as if welcoming me. Inside, the mirrors were gone, replaced by a single chair in the center of the room. On it sat an old man, frail and trembling, his face eerily familiar. He looked up, and I realized he had my eyes. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice layered with 100 others. "It feeds on us. It always has." As he spoke, the walls began to close in, the shadows thickening and coiling like serpents. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The old man reached out, his bony fingers brushing my arm, and in that instant, I saw it all. Every generation of my family, trapped in this house, their souls devoured by whatever lived within. My grandmother's face flashed before me, her voice echoing in my mind. "Never try and open it. Too late." The last thing I saw before the shadows consumed me was my own reflection in the mirrors that had reappeared, grinning with an unnatural hunger as the door slammed shut behind me. I never knew much about my mother's side of the family. She spoke of them rarely and always with a clipped tone, as if the words themselves carried a weight she couldn't bear. Growing up, I only ever met her mother once, a fragile, bird-like woman who looked at me with such hollow, terrified eyes that her face haunted me more than my nightmares. When my mother passed away suddenly, an aneurysm, the doctor said, I inherited the family estate, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had been left untouched for decades. The first time I saw it, standing at the end of an overgrown drive cloaked in mist, it looked less like a house and more like a mausoleum for forgotten things. The windows were blackened, the ivy clung to the walls like veins, and the air itself seemed wrong, heavy and sour, clinging to my skin like damp fabric. The lawyer handed me a key, muttering something about the house being part of the family obligation, and I half laughed, thinking it was just old-world melodrama. That was before I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, earthy and metallic, like damp soil and rusted iron. The second was the cold, not the kind you feel on your skin, but the kind that settles in your bones, gnawing from the inside. The halls were lined with portraits of ancestors, their faces eerily similar yet distinct, all staring down at me with expressions that grew more menacing the longer I looked. The house was alive with sound, not the creaks and groans of an old structure settling, but whispers that came from nowhere and everywhere, soft and unintelligible, yet unmistakably calling my name. The sense of unease grew sharper when I found my mother's journal in the study, hidden beneath a false drawer in her desk. The entries began benignly, describing the house and its history, but soon they descended into ramblings about the bloodline and the pact. She wrote about how the women in our family were cursed, bound to some ancient agreement made generations ago by a desperate ancestor seeking wealth and power. The price was steep. Every daughter born into the family carried a mark, invisible but undeniable, making them the next in line to feed the house. The final entry, smeared with what looked like dried blood, read, "I tried to run, but it's in the blood. It always finds us." I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding, and that's when I noticed the scratches on the floorboards. They formed a trail leading to the grandfather clock in the corner, its hands frozen at 3:13. Something compelled me to open the clock's heavy door, and inside, I found a staircase spiraling down into darkness. Every rational part of me screamed to leave, but something deeper, curiosity or maybe the bloodline itself, pulled me forward. The descent felt endless, the air growing colder and thicker until it felt like breathing through wet cloth. At the bottom was a cavernous room lit by a faint, pulsing red glow emanating from the walls, which were lined with jars of dark liquid that seemed to ripple as I passed. In the center of the room stood an altar, and on it lay a book bound in cracked, ancient leather, its pages filled with symbols that twisted and shifted as I tried to read them. My mother's name was scrawled on the last page, alongside dozens of others, each one crossed out except for mine. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing until they became a cacophony that rattled my skull. I turned to run but froze when I saw her, my grandmother, or at least what was left of her, standing in the shadows. Her skin was gray and stretched taut over her bones, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream, and her eyes, those hollow, terrified eyes, were locked on me. She raised a withered hand and pointed to the book, and in that moment, I understood. The bloodline wasn't just cursed, it was claimed. Every generation, one of us had to offer ourselves to whatever lived beneath this house to keep the rest of the family safe. My mother had tried to escape it, but the house had taken her anyway, as it always did. My grandmother had been the last offering, and now it was my turn. I ran, tripping and clawing my way back up the stairs, but the house seemed to shift around me, the walls narrowing, the doors slamming shut. The whispers turned to screams, voices crying out for release, for vengeance, for blood. By the time I reached the main hall, I was sobbing, my vision blurred, but the house wasn't done with me. The portraits stared down, their faces now twisted into grotesque mockeries, their mouths moving in silent chants. I grabbed the journal and the car keys, determined to escape, but as I stepped outside, the air grew thick and the world seemed to tilt. The driveway stretched endlessly, the trees leaning in as if to block my path. My car wouldn't start, the engine coughing weakly before dying completely. I screamed, banging on the steering wheel, but the house loomed in the rearview mirror, its windows glowing faintly red. I tried to run, but the ground turned soft beneath my feet, pulling me back toward the house like quicksand. When I looked down, I saw hands, dozens of them, pale and skeletal, clawing at my legs, dragging me backward. The last thing I remember is the front door swinging open, the whispers turning into laughter, and the house swallowing me whole. Now I sit in the study, my name scrawled in the book, waiting for the next generation to arrive. The house is patient. It always has been. I always knew something wasn't right with my family, but it wasn't until the night I uncovered the truth that I realized how deeply the darkness ran. We lived in an old farmhouse, far from town, the kind of place where secrets could fester unseen for decades. My father was a quiet man, his eyes always carrying a heaviness I couldn't understand, and my mother was even quieter, her voice often reduced to whispers behind closed doors. Growing up, I learned not to ask too many questions, especially about the locked door in the basement. "It's just storage," my father would say, but his tone always carried a sharpness that silenced any follow-ups. I tried not to think about it, but the door lingered in my mind like a splinter buried too deep to remove. When my parents passed away within months of each other, an accident, according to the coroner, I was left alone with the house and its oppressive stillness. The first few nights were uneventful, but on the fourth night, I heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the basement. It was faint at first, like the heartbeat of the house itself, but it grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore it. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I descended into the basement, the air growing colder with every step. The locked door stood at the far end, its paint peeling, the wood warped as if something had been pressing against it from the inside. My hands trembled as I forced the lock, the crowbar prying it open with a screech that echoed through the empty house. Behind the door was a staircase spiraling down into darkness, far deeper than the foundation should allow. The walls were lined with symbols carved into the stone, their shapes unfamiliar and unsettling, as if they were alive and writhing under the beam of my flashlight. The air was thick and damp, carrying a stench that made my stomach churn. Rotting flesh mixed with something metallic. I wanted to turn back, but something deeper than curiosity pulled me forward. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was covered in a dark, viscous substance that clung to my shoes, and at the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface slick with fresh blood. Around it were figures cloaked in black robes, their faces obscured by masks carved from bone. They chanted in a language I couldn't understand, their voices low and guttural, resonating in my chest like the growl of a predator. One of them turned toward me, and though I couldn't see their face, I felt their gaze pierce through me, cold and predatory. My instinct was to run, but my body refused to move, as if the very air had wrapped itself around me, holding me in place. That's when I saw it. A massive shadow writhing on the far wall, its form constantly shifting, tentacles and limbs emerging and retracting in a grotesque dance. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, and the shadow began to take shape, solidifying into something that wasn't quite human. It had no eyes, but I could feel it looking at me, its presence suffocating and ancient. One of the robed figures stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal my father's face, pale and hollow, his eyes black and lifeless. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a rasping echo. "You don't know what you've done." He raised a knife, its blade jagged and stained, and pointed it at the altar. My mother's body lay there, her chest rising and falling as if she were still alive, though her eyes were wide open, unblinking. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the shadow creature lunged toward her, its limbs enveloping her as her mouth opened in a silent scream. I finally found the strength to move, rushing forward to stop it, but the moment I touched the altar, a searing pain shot through me, and the world around me twisted. I was no longer in the chamber but in a void, surrounded by whispers and shadows. Images flashed before me, generations of my family performing the same ritual, offering their blood to this entity in exchange for power, wealth, and longevity. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandmother, they had all made the same deal, binding our bloodline to this ancient, insatiable force. I saw myself as a child, playing in the fields, unaware of the dark legacy that awaited me, and I saw my parents, their faces etched with guilt as they prepared me for the same fate. When I woke, I was back in the chamber, alone. The altar was empty, the robed figures gone, but the shadow lingered, watching me from the walls. It didn't speak, but its intent was clear. The ritual was incomplete, and the debt had passed to me. I stumbled out of the basement, locking the door behind me, but the whispers followed. At night, I dream of the shadow, its tendrils wrapping around me, pulling me into the darkness. The house feels alive now, its walls breathing, its floorboards creaking under unseen weight. I've tried to leave, but every road leads me back here, the shadow growing stronger with each passing day. I know what it wants, and I know there's no escaping it. The bloodline is cursed, and I am its final offering. The only question left is whether I'll go willingly, or if it will take me piece by piece. It began the night my grandmother died, when her last words to me were a whispered, "Never open the 8th door." At the time, I didn't know what she meant, but her frail hand clutched mine with a desperation that made her bony fingers feel like iron. After her funeral, I inherited her sprawling, crumbling manor, a relic of a bygone era that everyone in town avoided. The house was vast and unervingly symmetrical, its endless corridors filled with faded portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes following you no matter where you turned. Moving in was supposed to be temporary, a way to escape my small apartment and sort through her belongings. But the longer I stayed, the more the house seemed to seep into me. Each night, the walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards groaned with phantom footsteps, and I often woke to the sound of distant whispers. One evening, while exploring the upstairs hall, I noticed something strange. A series of identical doors lined the corridor, 7 in total, their brass knobs gleaming faintly in the dim light. Each opened to a mundane room, storage, a guest bedroom, a linen closet. But as I counted them again, a cold dread settled over me. There were 7 doors, but my grandmother had warned me of an 8th. That night, I dreamt of her standing at the end of the hall, her face hollow and her voice barely audible as she muttered, "Don't let it out." I woke drenched in sweat, but the dream left a compulsion I couldn't shake. The next morning, I paced the corridor, counting the doors again and again. 7, always 7. Until, as the light from the setting sun filtered through the dusty windows, I saw it. A shadow fell where no shadow should be, and there, nestled impossibly between the 3rd and 4th doors, was another door, its surface blackened as though burned. My breath caught in my throat as my trembling hand reached for the knob, but the moment I touched it, an icy shock shot up my arm, and the whispers erupted into a cacophony. They weren't distant anymore. They were around me, inside me, screaming in a language I couldn't understand but instinctively feared. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and ran down the stairs, determined to leave the house altogether. But the front door wouldn't budge, the windows wouldn't shatter, and no matter how far I ran, the house seemed to fold in on itself, pulling me back to that cursed corridor. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping, the days and nights blurring together as the house grew darker, colder, hungrier. The 8th door taunted me, its presence undeniable now, pulsing faintly as though alive. Finally, on the 7th night, I broke. Armed with a crowbar and a desperate need to end the torment, I forced the door open. The wood groaned and splintered under the strain, and when it finally swung inward, the air that escaped was thick and suffocating, reeking of decay and sulfur. Beyond the threshold was not a room but a void, endless and black, yet somehow teeming with movement. The whispers were deafening now, rising to a shrill, frenzied pitch as something began to emerge. A shape that was not a shape, twisting and shifting, all wrong angles and too many limbs, its eyes burning like coals. It stepped into the hall, and the house itself seemed to recoil, the walls cracking and bleeding as the thing turned its gaze on me. It spoke without speaking, its voice a low, guttural vibration in my chest. "You've set me free." I tried to run, but the floor buckled beneath me, the corridor stretching endlessly as the creature's laughter echoed in my skull. The portraits on the walls began to change, their faces twisting into grotesque, screaming visages that melted into shadow. I stumbled into the nearest room, slamming the door shut, but it was no use. The shadows seeped through the cracks, enveloping me, and I felt the cold press of countless hands pulling me down. I don't remember how I escaped, or if I even did. When I woke, I was lying in the overgrown garden, the manor now a smoldering ruin behind me. But the shadows hadn't left. They follow me wherever I go, their whispers growing louder each night, their presence creeping closer with each breath. I understand now what my grandmother meant. The 8th door wasn't meant to be opened, but it was never meant to stay closed either. It was a prison, and now its prisoner roams free, bound to my bloodline, feeding on us one by one. I can feel it watching me even now, waiting for the moment when my strength fails and I join the others it has claimed. But the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, is the knowledge that one day I'll hear the whispers again, and when I do, it won't be my voice they're calling. It'll be yours.